when I'm the secretary of the Pickens Historical Society. I put him in for Bill Cagle, who normally does the introduction. Tonight we have Chris Bell, president of Mid-Tree. He is going to both do some impressions and discuss history, turning into a comedy show and a history presentation all at once. So without further ado, here's Chris. He will be speaking here. You will probably notice the TV up there. That's where his slides will be shown. So if you look up there, it should be good. Thanks, Chris.
I thought I would open up with an idea that I had about Arnold Schwarzenegger if he did a commercial for Burger King. Now, I got to warn you up front, I'm not a comedian. I'm not very funny by nature. I probably do a really awful impersonation, but I'm going to try anyway. So Arnold, in these last 20, 30 years, has kind of become like from the Terminator to the Flabinator. Listen, I'm not one to talk. However, I was never, Arnold Schwarzenegger. But anyway, this is my idea. Hopefully you guys have seen a couple of his movies. If you did a commercial for Burger King. Yeah, get to the Whopper. It's all about the thighs, and the French fries. Who is your king? What does it do? All right, that's my impersonation. Go ahead and get started. So tonight, I want to look at everybody, but I don't want to look through people, so I'm going to stand over here and try to see that. I'm going to be basically going over about 8 different examples of different things, different locations I found. 7 of them are in Pickens County. 1 of them are in Cherokee County. I'm going to go over things like the difference between an abandoned cemetery and an abandoned church and a private plot. Homesteads, some of that are under the water, under lakes, under reservoirs, homesteads that are out in the middle of the forest. Ancient Indian sites. So I'm going to go over an ancient Indian village that's in our county that existed between 3000 BC and 500 AD. Went through a whole bunch of different stages as, a flourishing village, a diminishing village through different periods. And finally, I'm going to show you some stuff. I won't go too specific on location because I got to protect some things, but there's a ½ acre on one of our mountains in the west part of the county that's got 95 stacks of ceremonial Indian stones spread over a ½ acre, about 3-4 feet high, all on the west part of a mountain. So I'm going to go over all those kinds of things, and at the very end, I'm going to show you 2 examples of how to use nature, how to use trees, plants, springs, rock walls to find old structures. And then you can go back and verify it with maps. So I'm going to kind of work it from both angles. Right. So I think this says types of places. I can't really see. So it pretty much is all the things I just described. It's just kind of an outline of the nature of the speech. Next slide. So I'm going to begin with the community of Alice. Some people called it Alice Town. It never really was a town, never was a city. Some people said, well, they had a post office, so they're a town. Well, I got a news flash for everybody. If you had a post office in the 1800s or the first couple of decades of the 20th century, what a post office meant was that you had a dog trot home with a connected breezeway, and people would drop off bags of mail so they wouldn't get wet, and you were their hub. And so the postmaster was the guy that owned that house. So they had a post office just means that they had a mail center, and they had enough houses around where someone would come by in a buggy and deliver mail to the 10, 20, 30 homes. So Alice had a post office. They had a gold mine. They had an active gold mine beginning in the 1850s. As late as the 1880s, they weren't mining the mine anymore, but they were going through the local stream, still panning for gold. They're most famous for Harmony Mills. And Harmony Mills was started by the Atherton brothers. The Atherton brothers came over here from England, and they moved to New Jersey. In 1840, they moved to Roswell, and they started making different kinds of mills. They had a background in textiles, but for anyone that knows your British history, that makes sense. Then they moved to Talking Rock, they moved to Waleska, they made different kinds of mills, and finally they made Harmony Mills over in Alice. So on that map there from 1903, that's the Alice district. And the little black circle that says Alice next to it is where the schoolhouse was. They had a one-room schoolhouse. It's over by Town Creek, presently off of Salem Church Road by Jasper Jeep in the valley. Next slide. So there's their schoolhouse before it got torn down. It's a black and white photo, but that picture was taken around 1990. And there's their grist mill. So the remains of the grist mill are still there, but all that's left today is the rocks that comprise the mill. It's right next to the waterfall. So as you drive down Salem Church Road from 515, when you get down in the valley by what used to be the Standalone Farms, if you look out where Town Creek comes out of the mountains, there's a waterfall back there. And immediately on, I guess that would be the east side of the creek, there's the remains of the grist mill. Next slide. So there it is today. I took that picture in 2020. I had permission, just telling you I wasn't trespassing for this one, to be out there. Took some pictures. So there's the waterfall and the remains of the grist mill. Next slide. Now these are interesting stakes. These are up on the mountain to the left of the waterfall at about 30 feet. And these stakes used to hold what they call a mill race. For those of you that don't know, a mill race is a channel where they would divert water to propel Harmony Mills. Now this was great if you would have seen it, because back in the day in the 1800s, it was 500 feet long, 50 feet high, and it basically took all the water in a streamlined chute to come through and to power the mill, which was not right by the water. So it's past the grist mill, closer to the road. Now that water routes a channel if you walk around the mountain for 1.5 miles in circles before it reaches over to like 515 where that retention dam is. And that's where the original dam was built. So they moved water about 1/2 mile through 1.5 mile channel through a 500-foot mill race 50 feet in the air. That's some real engineering back in the 1800s. There's an example of a mill race that's still operational. This is in North Carolina. It's Mingo's Mill. And that thing off to the left, that's the mill race. So that's all water. And on the back side of that mill, there's a water wheel. And that powers that whole mill. So here's the old gold mine. It's filled in. It's got a tree growing up in front of it. You think that's a security tree? That's not very funny, but I think that's what it's for. It's all filled in. Again, if you go there with a shovel, you're going to find dirt and no gold. And that's what Alice looks like as a location from the road. So that's on Salem Church Road looking towards the waterfall straight back. It's pretty far away. It's kind of hard to see without binoculars, unless you're in the wintertime. So there's an aerial shot of the same area. So the house is up on the upper right is the property where the waterfall is, but the waterfall is back down to the right, kind of where that wooded area gets opened near the back, far right. Next slide. So that was Alice. Now this is much older. Carmel Mission was one of 3 missionary outposts in Cherokee Territory. It wasn't in Pickens County at the time because that was Gilmer County. So it's about 4 miles outside of Talking Rock. But before you get to Blaine, for those of you who may know where the Masonic Church is, or Masonic Temple is there on the left by Blaine where the old Fort Noonan is, it's on the other side of the road, across from a place called Priest Circle. It's about 500, 600 yards from the creek, just in the middle of the field. So Carmel Mission was the 3rd mission in the Cherokee Territory, but it was the 2nd one in Georgia. So Spring Place, where James Van was, started earlier than Brainerd Mission in Tennessee. This place started in 1819. So it's really kind of an interesting place because it was the first school, the first church, the first like organized community for teaching Native Americans. It operated between 1819 and 1836, 1839. Couple interesting things. It started from Massachusetts. The American Council of Foreign Missions decided to send someone here by the name of Isaac Proctor and a Reverend Moody. And they ran the place for a long time, and they never really had a big congregation or a turnout. It never really amounted to much, but they had crops and houses and places for people to live. They converted a few people to the faith. And then in 1831, Isaac Proctor became the first person that was arrested as a result of the new laws in 1830 that said if you were a white person living in Cherokee territory, you had to register with the state and swear your allegiance to Georgia. Isaac Proctor refused to do so, so they captured him and they took him all the way to New Echota, where later they arrested Samuel Worcester, and that's what spawned the Worcester versus the United States case. But so there's a drawing by Reverend Charles Walker done in 1987, and this isn't just one of those things that was kind of like an envisioning in his head. This was based on a missionary map that he had from 1819. It's really hard to see, so I apologize for that. But that's the original map sketched out by the missionaries. And so if you zoom in on that, and for those of you that are interested in this presentation, I'd be happy to email you this PowerPoint when I'm done, but it shows you where the corn was, where the schoolhouse was, where the cows were, where the crops were, where the houses were. That's what Charles Walker based his drawing. So there's a map from the state of Georgia, 1832. Notice there's no Pickens there because it's about 23 years before Pickens County started, but Carmel is on that map. It would say Blaine today, or Talking Rock. So there's the original map when they surveyed the land from 1832. And you see Carmel Mission is on that map right next to George Saunders' house. It also used to be known as Saunderstown. For those of you that know about the murder of Corntassel, the Indian, that happened right at the same place, but that's a different story. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. This is the last structure that was standing there. This is 1930. It's the very, very last building that was around from Carmel Mission. So it took about 100 years and they were all gone. And that's an aerial map of where it is today. So Carmel Mission is in the upper right corner in the field north of the road there. And Fort Noonan is down in the lower corner where the Indian removal fort was back in 1838. Next. So we're going to skip now to Cherokee County. So Andrew's Chapel was really a surprise. I don't know how someone told me about something, but they said, there used to be up on the hill over kind of near Yellow Creek, sort of north, a cemetery. That's what they told me. It didn't give me a lot to go by. Then later I started scouting through the plat maps of Cherokee County in the area, and I saw the cemetery on the map, so it kind of gave me a clue. Andrew's Cemetery or Chapel was started in 1832. It sprung up around the Franklin Gold Mine, and the local parishioners needed a place to go to church. It was closer than Hightower Church. So families like the Pascos, who really helped find start the area, and the Wilkies and some other names that are still common in that county, they're buried there. There's about 280 graves in this cemetery in the middle of a forest. Only 29 of those graves are still legible. That's all old it is. Cherokee Indians are buried there. They went to the congregation because they were there for 6 years before they got kicked out of here. So it was really a communal place. The chapel itself burned down in 1907, but I found the foundation still there. There's a depression in the earth in the shape of a rectangle with some rocks around it where the chapel used to be. One thing I want to point out, European churches are way different than North American churches, and I mean with the intentionality of how they're built. almost all European churches are built from east to west. They're laid out east to west. The entrance is on the western side, so the altar faces east. The church tower is in the west. And the cemeteries are always east of the cemeteries of the church. Here with the revival that we had in the 1860s and 70s, we've got churches that go north, south, east, west, every direction. But almost to a T, all the cemeteries are still east of the chapel. One other thing you'll notice before we get there is, this is kind of creepy, this is kid friendly but creepy. The closer you get to the church, the higher the land is. The higher land is because more people are buried closer to the church. The farther north you get from a church, the land goes downhill generally. And the farther north you go, the more scandalous the tombstones get. So you might see unnamed infant, slave, criminal, whatever. They're always on the north side of a church. On the east side of the chapel, downhill from the religious people that got buried closer to the church. Just an observation. So Andrew's Chapel was named after this Methodist. He was actually really controversial. He got in a lot of trouble with the Methodists because he had slaves, and there was a big kind of rift in the Methodist Church in the 1800s about slavery, but it was still named after him. Next slide. So there's the cemetery part of it. See how overgrown it is? If you look closely, you might see 5, 6, 7, 8 tombstones, but again, there's 250 out there, at least 280. And if you can take a look, you see how the land kind of gets slightly indented on the left and the right. That's the church foundation. That's where the building used to be, and it went from east to west, and the cemetery is on the east side of that church. And that's the plat map that I found that originally told me where it was. That's 369 there on the left, on the bottom. They're not really accurate with the description of how big the land is, but when you look into the original records, there's some old document from the 1800s that says some kind of Methodist group owns the land, but no one knows who really owns the land. It's not upkept, no one does projects and cleans it up, it's just abandoned. And that's an aerial shot of where it is today. When the church was originally built, Yellow Creek didn't extend that far. It was all woods where Yellow Creek is. Yellow Creek's that road to the left. The road diverted where the old administration building is with the ivy on the right, the last building remaining from the Franklin Gold Mine. The road went around that and came back down towards Matt Highway. But Matt Highway wasn't there either. The Alabama Road was there, but not right there. So right around the bend at the bottom where it kind of turns into an upward U, just north into the woods, about 25 yards, that's where the cemetery is. And the chapel is just off to the east of that. So Young Potts, for those of you who know, if you're from Big Canoe, you might know him. If you're familiar with Dahlonega or South Carolina around 1829, you might know him. He came down here for the gold rush in 1829, hit it really big in Dahlonega, and then decided he wasn't going to tell anybody. And so he took all his money and he came down to, wasn't Dickens County at the time, and he bought 500 acres over near Marble Hill, over near Wolf Scratch area, but really directly almost across from that dollar store on 53 up in the woods across from the church there. Young Potts had a small family, and basically he died by 1856, but he had a family plot, and I'm going to get into that and why in a minute. Next slide. So there we go. This is a topographical map from 1890. So this is about 60 years after Young Potts started the area. And Potts Mountain is obviously named after him. Potts Mountain is pretty much just north of his house where he lived. That's the same area where he lived. Now that says Mr. Paget and that's the land lot. Mr. Paget married one of Ponce's daughters, or granddaughters, and so he's buried in that family plot too. That's the 1903 map. That's just a map from 1915. If you look really closely, you'll see Potts Mountain down in the upper right by Volcom. There's some other town names or districts or whatever that we don't really familiarize with today, but that's there. Next slide. So, if you can tell where there's a little rectangle on this page, right to the right of it, there's a red dot where I drew a red dot. That little road ends at the rectangle, that's Potts' house. The red dot is where the cemetery is, and again, it's east of the house. And that's an aerial shot from 1947. The house is up there in the upper left. There's an outbuilding down below it along the road. In that cleared area, that's a circle, that's the cemetery. So the reason we had a family plot was A, we didn't have cars. B, we didn't have refrigeration. C, we didn't have roads, not real ones. They needed a place to bury it. There was no churches nearby. So he made a family plot. Just to the left of his house, there's a spring. Well, that spring was necessary for him to live and for his cattle to live. And so you see those big trees maybe up around his house. That's the shade trees for his cattle. It's always the same story. There's his house. That picture was taken around 1890. So I think those are women on the porch. Not really sure. They don't look like men to me. I know young Potts was dead by 1856, so it's definitely not him. And this was so fun. So I'm trouncing through the woods. I got this rough idea of where this place is based on all these old maps. And I'm coming in from the other side of this arrow sign, which is on the tree already. And so I see an arrow. I don't see the word cemetery on it, but I started jumping up and down because it was really getting dark. It was really getting creepy. And I'm looking for a cemetery. And then I find an arrow. And, I hope it doesn't say, something more sinister on the other side of it. But I walk around and it says cemetery. And obviously, that's an old sign. So I follow a little trail, and that's young Potts' tombstone, 1856. So the sign there on the left that looks different is because that sign, when I found it, was on the ground, completely eroded. No words were on it anymore. It was still in directional error. So I took it to some friends and had them paint the word cemetery on it, and I came back out and I put it back up where it used to be, facing the direction to the other side. And that's just another grave that's there. There's 7 graves total, including Mr. Paget that I told you about later. So, off of Bent Tree Drive, behind Mountain View Community Church, between Penley Circle and Long Swamp Baptist Church Road, there's 28 acres, surrounded by a bamboo forest. And if you walk through that bamboo forest, you'll find this homestead that's still standing. It has about 6 chimneys on it. It's built in 1840. First occupants were the Cowart family. The Cowart family were the original family that donated the land for Long Swamp Baptist Church. Later, through the deed record, I found out they sold it to the Fitz family. And then around 1941, it went into the Hendricks family. Now, the relatives of the Hendricks family were descendants of the guy that Hendricks Mountain was named after, John Hendricks. But if you look at those family names and you look at their trees or a lot of their early families, I don't mean to say this, but it was a small group of families. They're all interrelated at some level. And it's just the way it worked. So there's the house on a map from 1926. The little road there that ends at the house. Today that road is a circular road, but in 1926 it was just a little one-way. Next slide. There's an aerial map from 1955. So the circular road that kind of looks like a teardrop on the upper left, the back side of that, like an ice cream cone, was the house. Today you can't see that, it's just forest. So this is the deed, and you can't really read this, but near the bottom, it mentions some good features that we've lost over time. So it says this property was right along Settlement Road. Settlement Road ran north and south from the Dawsonville Jasper Road, which is Cove Road, towards what is now Bentry. But it mentions it commences at a line by Harrison Penley's house and kind of bisects to the Fitz property and then by Long Swamp Church. And there in the 1903 map, you see Harrison Penley's house. And this property was on land lot 8 and 7, but only about 10 acres of 7. So mostly this property is located in the upper left corner of land lot 8. And Long Swamp Baptist Church is in the same spot because that's the spot it was moved to after the tornado moved it in like 1874. That's the house today. The house is about 3,000 square feet. It's got multiple extensions. The original center of the house is just a log structure, a log cabin structure. It's a square, and then they built walls around that. And then I guess every couple of kids later, they built another room, put another fireplace. I'm assuming they had a lot of kids because they got a lot of rooms and a lot of fireplaces. But the place is still in great shape because it's got a metal roof. And it's honestly held up because of all the chimneys. The chimneys are the primary support. There's a tree in the back of the house that holds up the back porch, but mostly the house is intact. I've been inside of it. I did have permission to go into this one too. And I've got some correspondence, letters written by the last Hendricks family relatives between each other, and I sent it to the current relatives who are out of state. You know, I took photos of all of it, and they're like, oh, wow, that's my great-great-grandma. I didn't know she could say things like that in 1963. I'm like, well, we all talked, you know. So anyway, but I did find some correspondence, and I passed it along to the family. That was fun. Okay, Sally Doss is a kind of a Bentry person, Clay Paget, who his real name really wasn't Clay. His name was Vidi, which is kind of weird, like the Latin name Vidi. Anyway, Clay Paget is a relative of Sally Doss through marriage, but Sally Doss was really from the Penley family. Sally Doss was born Sally Penley, and when she was about 18, she was living in Sugar Hill, and she fell in love with the neighbor next door. Edward was, 18 and a strapping young lad, and he went off to fight in the Civil War, and he died of a disease at Bean Station, Tennessee, along with his brother within a week. I don't know if they really died of a disease or made enemies, but Sally quickly applied for a pension and took her $132 and bought 245 acres in the land that's now Bentry, most of it under what now is Lake Tamarack. She never got married again. She died in 1913 and she was a widow. Census listed her as a farmer. So there's Sally on the 1903 map, and that's Long Swamp Creek. That's along her house going kind of north to south. And so she had farmland in a pretty fertile area. She bought it from Elias Allred for people that know county history. And that's her. I put a little dot there off to the left in 1926. That's where her house was then, but this, I'm going to show her under the, this is the house there in the upper left with the bisected roof. Upper left, there's like a couple of buildings by it. That's her house. And that valley that goes through there in the middle, that's Long Swamp Creek. And that little white dot under Lake Tamarack, that's where her chimney is today. You can still find it with a fish finder. It's about 45 feet down. And the fish, they like to swim under the little chimney part where you put your wood. It's a little place for them to be safe and have their little fry babies and all that stuff. But that's where it is still. And that's what the house looked like in the 1950s. That's Clay Paget's house. Him and his wife were big into Sharptop Baptist Church and had lots of musical talent and had lots of people over and were really active in the community. I got a picture of them at home at the foot of Sharptop in 1913, like right before they got married.
I went to that house for my grandmother in the 50s.
You went there in the 50s? That's the one, right? Under Lake Tamarack.
No,
Well, I mean, there's today.
in
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't, Lake Tamarack wasn't there then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he happened to go to this house when he was a little kid. Same place. He remembers going there with his grandmother. Yes?
On Finley Creek, you've got that old little building that's right there next to the road. You know what I'm talking about?
Which part of Henley Creek?
When you go the road, you go around Finley Creek and then you come up to Monson. So that little road, that little building is right there. I could almost touch it when I drive by.
Does anyone else know the old building she's talking about?
Well,
I believe you, I just don't, I'm not sure. Sorry. Next slide, please. So, I don't know why I got so into the Dude Ranch thing, but it was a thing. The Whittington family were really wealthy. They were from Atlanta. Charles Whittington was the consul for Cuba back when that was allowed to be a thing in Atlanta. And they moved up here in 1911. They took a train to Tate and came in their fancy kind of Victorian garb. It must have been a real eyesight for the people in Tate. And then people came in with a bunch of pickup trucks and moved this high-end furniture down. And they went out into, I guess, the Bentry area. He bought about 2,500 acres. And the Champion family, Lily Mae Champion, who's now at Penley, her dad, Vernie Champion, when he was 14, he built the Whittington home. Now, it might seem that's young when you're 14, but he was pretty industrious. So he built what Lily Mae always referred to as being a mansion. When you're about 5 years old, the place I'm about to show you, because I found a picture of the Dude Ranch and a picture of the Whittington Mansion, it's a big house for 1911. It had a giant porch on it and a bunch of rooms, and Charles had parties there, and when he was gone for the summer, he was always traveling around. They would rent it out as the Glad Joe Inn, named after the two daughters, Gladys and Josephine. But they never really made any money. He was trying to sell the land as a land developer. He told people in an ad in the paper that it was 4,000 feet above sea level. Well, Mount Oglethorpe's 3,200 feet, so I don't know what he was thinking, because this place was at 1,800 feet. So maybe he didn't have an altimeter or whatever, but it didn't work out for him. So later, the Whittingtons moved out around 1925. Sam Tate bought their land, put it under the Georgia Marble Company, and just rented it out to a series of families for years. And in 1933, 4 years into the Great Depression, 1 year into Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps, Sam Tate had a brilliant idea. I'm going to put 200 men here for free labor, and I'm going to build roads up Mount Oglethorpe to start the Appalachian Trail, and then they can get to my Tate Mountain Estates, and I don't have to pay for any of it. I'll just give them a place to stay. So the headquarters of the CCC was the Whittington House, the Dude Ranch. This is just, if you look on the map on the left, this is from the Southern Guide to the Appalachian Trail, 1942. The Dude Ranch is there on the map. Mount Oglethorpe is there on the right. It was just a waypoint for them to travel up, because the trail that went up to Mount Oglethorpe started from there, because that's where the CCC guys built the road from. And this is Professor Perot's hand-drawn map. It's hard to see in this presentation. Again, if I get emails, I'll send it to you, but the Dude Ranch is on there, and along with some mountain names that we've forgotten the names of. So Denny Ridge in Bentry is named after Denny Top. That's on this map. There's a north and south Sassafras Mountain. There's a round top that nobody talks about anymore. I got a map at home that he made. It's about 4 feet by 3 feet. We've got all kinds of mountains in this county that people forgot about, like Dread Mountain and all kinds of spooky names. The Devil's Half Acre. It's a real place. So here is the Dude Ranch House and the Whittington House as the headquarters of CCC Camp 1449 P77. The P stands for private because it was on private land. This was the first CCC camp to get started in the state of Georgia. They got started before everybody else because Professor Perot, who had already done all the surveying of the land, already knew all the ways around. So it was real easy for him to employ a bunch of guys to build roads because he already knew everything. He already walked all these lands. And those are all the officers within the camp, by the way. That's just another angle to show you the size of the house. So again, 1911, this is a pretty big house to be built in the middle of nowhere. So Bernie Champion, at the age of 14, really did a heck of a job. I just want to point that out. This is 20 years later, 30 years later. And that's the camp, the full camp. So when you're looking on the right, there's a bunch of tents. Each of these tents housed about 11 men. There's 2 rows of tents. At the far end of the tents is the Dude Ranch house that we just showed you, where headquarters for. All the other buildings on the left are makeshift places like barber shops and cooking tents and a cantina, all those kinds of things. Next. And that's that same view today. That's the 6-hole of Bentry's golf course. That's the same tree line. There's a spring down the hill to the right and the left. That's where they got their water. It's exactly where the camp is. I'm standing on the green in this photo looking back to where you hit the ball. But the camp was right there where the lane kind of slopes in. Now we're going to get into some Indian sites. So somewhere in Rich Mountain, and I'm not going to get more specific than that. Again, there's a half acre with 95 stacks of Indian stones, like the Big Canoe Rock Park, which has about 15 of these. Interestingly, both places are at 1,800 feet elevation. Both are on the east side of the mountain. Both are at the headwater of a spring. And I'm just saying that's coincidental. Both stacks of rocks, per the archaeology reports I've read, were from 5000 BC to 2000 BC. But there's one of these up on Rich Mountain. It's really hard to walk there. I just want to point that out to you.
Is there any possibility this is connected to the stuff that's on the workout?
It's from a similar period. A lot of these sites, they weren't like burial stones. There's a lot of these along the Appalachian Trail in different states. They had some kind of religious ceremonial purpose that we don't really know about it anymore. There were people that would say that these were punishment piles built by settlers who punished their kids in the middle of nowhere, but I've read that in some archaeology reports, but I'm like, okay, there's no houses near here. So what you're gonna do is send your 3 teenage boys who are getting into trouble, cow tipping on top of Rich Mountain over a half acre and give them 10 years of hard labor. I don't think so. Anyway, so this slide is a clue, okay? I gave you a clue there in the writing. There's a street called Mystic Trail Lane. And this is how I found the place. And I know that's really far-fetched, but it's true. I'm looking at an aerial map of Sharp Mountain Preserve. And I see a street called Mystic Trail Lane. And I call up my friend who hikes all the time and lives there. So you don't have any Indian rock piles, do you, anywhere up near the mountain? He's like, oh yeah, that's a bunch of punishment piles for kids. I said, okay, can you show me where it's at? He's like, yeah, it's right by Mystic Trail Lane. I said, I wonder why the developer named it that. Yeah, right? Bentry does this too. We've got names of streets that are named after things that they found when they built the place. And so this is just kind of, sometimes developer leaves you clues and sometimes it's roads. So the triangular mountain over there in the upper right is Sharp Mountain. Across that is 515, the valley where Jasper is there. So all our mountains, Mount Oglethorpe are on the far right of this page. Mystic Trail Lane over there on the left, and that's up on Rich Mountain. That's the only clue I'm giving you. Next. This is the archaeological report that I have from the site. This is designated as 9 PI 22. 9 meaning the 9th state in the Union, PI meaning Pickens County, 22 meaning the 22nd archaeological site that they ever found in Pickens County. That map, every single triangle, if you can see it, represents one of those rock piles. Here's one of them I took with my camera. Pretty sure that's not a punishment pile. Next picture. There's another one. Now add 93 to those over a 10-minute walk, and you begin to feel when you're there the significance of the site. And you don't feel like, man, this kid's really got in trouble. It's really amazing. It's kind of, for me anyway, I'm not like trying to be mystical or weird about it, but it feels like a very somber place and a very connected place, and a place I've only taken 2 people to because I just wanted to trust the people that I took there, that A, they wouldn't show anyone else, and B, they wouldn't mess with anything. And both people that I took to the place were kind of overwhelmed by the site. Next slide.
There used to be a microwave tower at the top of that.
No comment.
Okay.
You know what that means?
Okay.
Yeah, so so Murphy Bottom is another site. Now, Murphy's named after the Murphy family off of Jerusalem Church Road. They're farmers, but there's a mountain on the other side of this road called Murphy Top. Well, guess what? Murphy Bottom's on the other side of Murphy Top. Just as a clue. And on the opposite side of the road from Murphy Top, off of Jerusalem Church Road, kind of really close to 53, there's this flat triangular plain, which is open, still a field. And then in 1956, it was excavated by a guy named John Ware. John was an amateur archaeologist out of Fairmount, and he found a whole bunch of stuff, to include burnt corn cobs and pottery and weapons and stuff. And if you talk to a lot of the locals that live in the west side of the county, they'll tell you if you go out there after a big rain, you're going to find arrowheads. I mean, you're still finding arrowheads. This is a major Indian site from 3000 BC to 500 AD. This is designated as 9 PI 12. So they found this one before the other site. But there's a map from an archaeology report, and the Murphy Bottom site is exactly where it is. And this went through several phases of Indian development. This is pre-tribal Indians. So this is before we had Cherokee, before we had Creeks, before we had Iroquois, Yamasee. This is a bunch of guys used to band together and hunt. And this is with their little agricultural center, village site. Next slide. That's the picture from the sky today. So there's Jerusalem Church Road in the field on the right with the 3 kind of rectangular, angular, different colored crops. That's where it is. And if you go out there, I don't suggest you do it without permission, but if you went after a heavy rain and went out in the field and probably dug down 6 inches, you'd find a bunch of stuff. Next slide. The reason I point that Murphy Bottom out to you, that's what it looks like from the road. It is the most substantial and most significant Indian village site in Pickens County, period. Totally. All time. Okay, now for the fun part for me. Clues from nature and from humans. So what do we have here? If you're out in the field and you see a giant shade tree, it's normally an oak tree, and at the base of that oak tree you see a bunch of daffodils, those daffodils are perennials, and those perennials come up every year. 50, 100, 150 years after the house is gone, after the garden is gone, the flowers come back every year. Then you keep looking, you'll find a rock wall. Sometimes it's a garden boundary, sometimes it's a foundation. Then you keep looking, you'll find a spring because they didn't have plumbing back there. But the shade tree was employed to keep cattle kind of in a good spot. And the spring was used for all of their water. Obviously, perennials grow up with or without a spring. But the houses all grow up around those. After you find the foundation, you'll sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll find a chimney. Next slide. So here's example 1. So here we're looking at well, let me see. This isn't Bentry Drive. This is the one towards Talking Rock. Just past Country Kids. Headed towards Talking Rock. There's a little road that kind of bisects the railroad with a dot. That dot is where the house is, but I didn't find this place through the map. Next slide. I was driving down the road and I saw that tree. So I pulled up closer, and then if you look close by the tree, you'll see these little perennials here, daffodils, wild daffodils. Next slide. And then I went out in the woods and I found more wild daffodils, and then I saw a foundation back there behind it. Next slide. And then I found this wooden fence that was still kind of standing for a garden. Next slide. Then I found this chimney, completely enclosed by the woods. I could not see that from the road. I could not see the fence from the road. I did find the spring next to the big tree. But again, this all started with the tree. I found the house on the map at the back end, not at the front end of the discovery. So I was using these natural kind of clues to get there. Next slide. Next slide. Example 2. This is off of Bent Tree Drive, back behind Craft Realty, in the valley immediately south of Bent Tree. There's a little dot in a road that comes from the circle that doesn't exist anymore. Next slide. So I went back there based on the map, and then I found this wonderful spring. It was still running today. Next. There's a rock wall going left to right, back behind those first couple of trees, and then another rock wall and some leftover items from a property. Next slide. Then this tree, kind of hard to see in the photo, there's a barbed wire fence. That's what's left of it hanging down from the tree. So this was a boundary of the property. I also found burn barrels. I found a tree fort. I found a road bed. This one I started with the map, but then I found all the things I normally find when I go looking for these. Next slide.
Good.
All right. So basically, I hope that was okay. 7 of those sites, again, were in Pickens County. All of them are abandoned. They're all fun, and I take tours for free. If you guys want to ever go out to these places, I'd be happy to show you how to do this in real time. It's one thing to hear me say it and to show you a map, but for me to get down and show you resources and where to find topographical maps and all this other stuff, it's kind of a nerd labor of love. But in the woods is the fun part. In the fields, by the springs, by the rocks, that's the fun part. And then every time I find a new place, I just get a little more excited, and I document it, and then I keep records of it. I have a website called Pickens Past. It's kind of catchy. .com. I've got about 90 history articles on there with maps and explanations and backstories and photos. But I hope you guys enjoyed this tonight. I'm welcome to take questions if you guys got them. Any questions? Scott?
So Sally, so you're talking about Sally Doss in the chimney.
Yep.
I'm familiar with the Sally Doss chimney that exists on the hilltop of the Sally Doss Trail above water.
No,
The Sally Doss chimney that's underwater.
the Sally Doss chimney, the real house, is under the water, under Lake Tamarack. Now, I want you to think about it. You probably don't know based on the street, because the street's misspelled, but it's another clue. The developer named it Paget Court instead of Paget Court. And right off the end of that is Clay Paget's house, because he didn't know that Sally Doss was there. Clay Paget bought Sally Doss's house in 1913. They misspelled it and they left it Paget Court. But that's where it is, right off the end of that road. If you drove off that road into the water and swam down 45 feet, you'd find it. The other chimney is still on her land. Okay, she had more than one house. She had 245 acres. Okay, so it's a big place. Next question. Anyone? If you don't have any other questions, I'd be happy just to wrap up, and thank you all for coming.
What drove you to pick up this lot?
I moved here in November of 2018, and I read an article online from Don Wells that kind of went over Sam Tate and the Dude Ranch, but it didn't have any photos of the real Dude Ranch. It didn't have much on there. And I just happened to like puzzles a lot, and I wasn't much of a historical person before I moved here, but you have to think about something from a context. Pickens County, here we are in 2023, and we've got a population of 32,000 people. And you take a look at a place like Atlanta, and you think about not just population density differences, but all the concrete and overbuilding. This place, a lot of it is still like it was 200 years ago, 300 years ago. So living in Pickens County is literally like looking through a crystal ball if you pay attention to it, right? I couldn't do that somewhere else. So I became interested in that here because I realized that I could do that here. But that's pretty much it. I read an article and then I kind of dorked out on it. Yes.
The Coward is slides that we show. You have a first name for Coward?
For Coward, yeah, Robert is one of them. It was the original people that donated the land or some of the acreage to Long Swan Baptist Church. Later, it went to Henry Fitz and his relatives, and then by the time it hit the Hendrickses, it was Ada, Cicero Hendricks, William Hendricks, the sons of Jackson Hendricks, the relatives from that line. So like the grandkids of John Hendricks. So that's how that went.
So have you ever heard of or researched the ditch
Can you be more specific?
on Coward Mountain Road on the backside of John Coward's property? There was the ditch before there was the reservoir lake built on Cove Road.
Okay.
And the ditch was maintained by Georgia Marble Company. They used it as their cooling.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. So basically, what she's referring to is back in the 1920s, there was a pipeline built, a water pipeline built all the way from across Cove Road to the ditch that used water to cool the marble mines and the work that they did. They pumped the water uphill and they used the gravity fed system on the other side of McLean Mountain to force it down into the mines. The mines go all under that area anyway, if you think about it. The mines aren't like contained to that side of 53. They extend well under. So if you're living in Bentry sometimes and you're like, oh, I got a rumble. And then my seismograph hit a 2.2. Well, sometimes that's just miners doing their work. It's not always a tannerite birth party in the west part of the county.
Well, everybody in the county used that as Sunday entertainment.
Yes.
You went to church, you came home, you ate lunch, and then you walked the ditch.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of those forgotten pieces of history that most people. I have a diagram of a lot of the different pump parts that they use. You got one too. So, anyone else? Yeah.
Same territory that she's talking about. Do you know where the boarding house is that I stayed in
Which house did you say?
Do you know where the boarding house is that I stayed in?
I don't have the specific location of the boarding house. I'm sorry. Sorry. Most of my focus hasn't really been much beyond Sam Tate and his land ownings and some of the things that he got started here, but I didn't get down to that level of detail.
What she's referring to, my grandfather, John Coward, owned where our POA building is in Big Blue. The family lived there, but he boarded somewhere around Marble Hill, would walk over on Monday morning, stay all week, and then walk back on Friday afternoons. When he got to Low Gap, going into what's now Big Blue, he would yell, and my grandmother would be out in the yard waiting for him because word of mouth was not very dependable even back then.
Sure.
And he wanted to know that the family was still alive.
Well, right. So.
Before he hit home.
So back on to that point, that map that I have in my presentation for Professor Perot, the backside of the CCC road that he built goes to Lake Sconty. Okay, and so he had mapped out all those roads back through the Low Gap, and I've got all those maps too. So I can send you some of that if I get your information later. Be happy to share that with you. Yeah.
Have you had a chance to explore Paget Mountain? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah. I've been to Paget Mountain, and I've also been to Paget Falls. I've also been to the Paget Private Cemetery out kind of near, that was a hard one to find, kind of near the Marble Hill Baptist Church area in the Fitzsimmons Cemetery. It's back there in the woods.
It's nice and untouched.
It's still untouched. I went out there and it was really weird. I asked the guy that owned the land, I'm like, hey, is there a cemetery around here? He's like, yeah, it's right off 10 feet off from my trailer, right? And I walked back there and there's these little wooden crosses. And like, what I'm looking for is not wooden. It's a couple of 100 years ago. He showed me a pet cemetery. He didn't know what I meant. And then so I'm like, dude, no, there's a real cemetery over here. So I found it, and I took him to it. He's like, oh yeah, that's the cemetery. I remember now. I'm like, all right, well, thank you for showing me the pet cemetery. Anyway, so that really happened. That was really funny.
Okay, the only other comment that I had, the rock mounds that you were referring to.
Yeah.
And the,
Yes.
aisles.
Yeah.
Any farmer who had a lot of kids
Yep.
had those kids out working in the garden.
Sure.
They didn't have them piling up rocks.
No, it's absurd. There's a little more to the story, and I'm going to reveal more than I'm probably supposed to here, but in 1986, Rich Mountain, all the way down through Scarecorn Creek, all the way down to Jerusalem Church, was going to be a double-lake reservoir built by Oglethorpe Power Company. And when they found this archaeological mound site, it kind of got in the way of what they wanted to do. And so one of the kind of shrewd but not so nice people, he went ahead and he took a modern horseshoe and he put it under one of the rock piles. So then they went and said, oh, this isn't a historical Indian site, there's a horseshoe. We can still build the power company. We can still build the reservoirs. It didn't work, but someone tried that. It's in my archaeological reports, it's crap. And just so you know, the way I found that was really aggravated. I found it in a footnote, a reference to the original report. After looking for a year and a half, I found a footnote, said Rich Mountain site. I couldn't find any digital things. Archaeologists are kind of really private and they don't let everyone look at their stuff anyway. So then I saw the name of the person who wrote the report. I did a Google search, found a guy by the name of Thomas Gresham, and I picked up my phone and I called him and I said, Thomas, you don't know me, this is going to sound weird. I say this to everybody now. I'm some guy that lives somewhere, I've only been here for a couple of years, but did you write a report back in 1986 about Rich Mountain? He's like, I can't believe you called me. I said, what do you mean? This is during COVID. He's like, I'm going out of business in a week. I'm going to mail you the original 300-page book that I have, not just on that one archaeological site, but on 300 sites in Pickens County. And he put it in the mail, and he mailed it to me. And I still have it by sheer luck. And Tom and I are still friends today, but it was just what I like to call directed luck. You know, I was too persistent, too pesky, too willing to call strangers, and I lucked out, because if I called him 7 days later, I never would have known about it. But that's how I found out about that one. Any other questions or stuff? All right, well, thank you, everyone. This was fun. I appreciate you.